apologize. I'm going to be sitting today. Last night I got the great idea to dance to some of Gary's great music, and I think C4 went that way and D5 went that way, and my spine is in some trouble this morning, so I apologize. What a great honor to be here. And I thought last night when we kicked things off with Andy's extraordinary speech, you got a sense of the dire circumstances that I think many of us see our country in. And today I want to talk to you about one of the areas of battle that I don't think conservatives or freedom-loving Americans appreciate is one of the ground battles. And so when people ask me, how did we get to this point? One of the things that I think is really true as a journalist as I've watched it is that those who love freedom, those who believe in the American experience as it's been, those who believe in law and order, they have lost the narrative in America. They've lost it to teachers who've indoctrinated your children to think that this color of your skin is going to determine your outcome in your life. That's called critical race theory, and it's everywhere in our school system right now. They're taught to believe that chanting the slogan, "From the river to the sea" is okay, even though it's an anti-Semitic slogan that means we want to take Israel out of existence. Now, how did that happen? It happened because for 20 or so years, our competitors, those who want to bring a more socialist agenda to America, European-style socialism here, they decided to focus on the narrative. I'm going to give you a little history of what that narrative looks like, how it got implemented, who's been behind it, so that you know what the enemy is, and you can begin to create the strategies that will counter it, particularly going into the 2024 election. Now, before I do that, I know it feels bleak a lot of times when we're looking at the current circumstances and we see an open, lawless border and we see the things going on in our schools. But I want to remind people it wasn't that long ago when those in Great Britain thought, well, we'll never be able to exit the European Union and its suffocating policies. And then an extraordinary effort with people like Nigel Farage and Steve Bannon and others, they came about and they actually made Brexit happen. And I can remember in the first year of the Trump presidency, it was heading into the fall, and President Trump didn't have a single accomplishment. All he had were 14,000 headlines about Russia collusion, which, by the way, never existed. And then a group called Job Creators Network stepped into the void, and they came up with an idea. Members of Congress are reluctant. I actually remember being with Paul Ryan. I'm not sure this is the time to do tax cuts. I love tax cuts, not now. Job Creators Network stepped into the void. And they said, we're going to do it now. We got to get a win before the end of the year. And of course, now we enjoy one of the largest tax cuts in American history because of that brave moment. And you can go through history and you can find other recent examples where people were a little demoralized, and then through ingenuity, through determination, through the values that Job Creators Network has created and espoused and given a voice to, that solutions were made. And I do believe right now there's an opportunity for solutions. And a lot of this that I just mentioned all traces back to a singular person, to a singular visionary, and that is Bernie Marcus and the Marcus Foundation. All of the things I just talked about would not have happened if it weren't for Bernie's vision, if it wasn't for his generosity, if it wasn't for his determination to defeat those things that actually ailed America or ailed the world in the case of Brexit. So as you are looking at this, there's lots of hope even in the midst of what seems like a very dark moment in American history. Now, I talked about the narrative a little bit, and I wanted to focus on where it started, because about 4 or 5 years ago, I did a deep dive research to try to figure out where this concept of censorship was coming, how could it be that the United States could create the illusion that its president was a spy of Russia when there was not an ounce of evidence, not an iota of evidence. Even the Biden Justice Department released a report now confirming that. And the answer is somebody took a lot of time to create the illusion of truth, to create the skills in the 21st century to fool people into thinking what they saw was real when in fact it was nothing more than an illusion. To know when that moment started, we have to go to right after President Bush defeated Al Gore in the Bush v. Gore Supreme Court case, because a group of demoralized liberals led by people like George Soros, John Podesta, still in the White House again now with this president, they decided that they would no longer leave the fate of elections into the hands of the Democratic Party and the establishment sort of institutions of the Democratic Party. They were frustrated. They felt like, ironically, now they say this, their election had been stolen from them. How about that? And so they got together in early 2001, and they said, we're going to build an alternate ecosystem in America, and we are going to own the narrative in America. And that sounds like a very esoteric thing, but as we go on in the next few minutes, I think you'll understand it was a very real war plan. Now, at that moment, you have to appreciate what they saw was going on in America. They believed that Republicans and conservatives had the superior communications narrative capabilities. And actually, since the Reagan era, that was probably true. A lot of people don't know that one of the most powerful tools Ronald Reagan had, beyond his own speaking skills, beyond his fireside chats, was he was the inventor, along with Richard Viguerie and others, of direct mail. And people would go to their mailbox in the 1970s, and they would get a message that literally influenced them and engage with the conservative movement. And Democrats never were able to counter direct mail. And it was as good as it was for fundraising, it was a powerful tool for setting a narrative in America. Then the 1980s and 1990s came along, and Rush Limbaugh came about, and Sean Hannity, Bill O'Reilly, and conservatives dominated the medium of the time for political talk, and that was talk radio. And as Al Gore proved, liberals couldn't actually compete there. You all remember the failure called Air America. And then the dividing of the great cable news audience occurred, and Fox News stepped into the void, and they are still the juggernaut today, 25 years later. And again, the left tried to compete, and they put an MSNBC out there, and of course they already had most of the mainstream media, but they never created something as powerful as Fox News. And by 2001, people like George Soros and the left, the funders, they realized we are at a strategic disadvantage, and we're not going to win elections going forward if we can't seize the narrative from those on the right who are winning it right now. And they set out and they had all these plans, and their goal was to create an alternative ecosystem that would change the narrative in America to what these lefties really like. And I want to give one anecdote of how they did it, because their theory was if you own the narrative, actually, if you own the language of the debate, you can own the narrative of the debate. If you can own the narrative of the debate, you can own action in America. And if you own the action in America, you will own the elections going forward. And they said this may take us 10 or 20 years. And really, the manifestation of their strategy was in 2016 with the Christopher Steele dossier and sort of the first embedding of a completely fake narrative. But as it went on, they had to get tools and infrastructure and ideas. And so does anyone know how much George Soros gives away each year to liberal causes? Anyone want to take a gander at just the size of it? $1.7 billion. That's the average of the last 5 years. $1.7 billion. And he has brought to politics something that usually doesn't exist in politics, and that is an ROI-driven, corporate-style demand that you only get your money if you deliver the ROI. You don't get your next tranche of money unless you actually deliver what you told me you were going to deliver. And he created a mentality and a mindset to march along this 20-year plan to seize the narrative in America. I'm just going to give you one example, because I witnessed this as a senior executive of the Associated Press back in the early 2000s. George Soros obviously wanted to, he's open about this, he wants open borders in the world, and particularly in the United States. They realized, though, that those who wanted law and order borders actually had a very powerful term. Someone who crossed the border was always known for the first 200 years of American history as an illegal alien. It's a very harsh term because it actually is meant to be a harsh term. And George Soros and his team and those around him, isn't just George, but a lot of others, they set out to change the language of the narrative of immigration. And their first goal, I was sitting at the AP when this inquiry came, we want to go from illegal alien to illegal immigrant. And the truth of the matter is, illegal immigrant sounds a little more friendly than illegal alien. But that's not where they wanted to start. They just wanted to move an inch into the foray into this. A few years later, they wanted to change it to undocumented worker. And they did it again. And all the style guides of the major news media, funded by this George Soros sort of effort, they changed it from illegal alien to illegal immigrant to undocumented worker. You remember this, you saw this going on, like, what's an undocumented worker? Well, their ultimate goal was to get undocumented worker changed, as Barack Obama ultimately succeeded to do, to dreamer, because a dreamer sounds a heck of a lot better than illegal alien. That is the strategic concept that George Soros brought to seizing the narrative. And over the next 20 years, he set out to own the narrative in ways big and small. He gave hundreds of millions of dollars to news organizations to fund individual products. He helped create, and other liberal funders like him, helped create things like ProPublica, which during the early 2010 timeframe actually wrote a series of stories routinely trying to stop the natural gas revolution in America by saying that fracking actually pollutes drinking water. It's not true. In fact, the Obama EPA ultimately had to come out and say it wasn't true. But they actually tried to stop it. Now, why is that? Because those who were funding them wanted a solar and wind America, not a natural gas America. And cheap natural gas would eradicate that vision for the Soroses and others who were trying to fund that America. So they set out to create narratives. And that narrative building got bigger and stronger and smarter and wiser. And by 2016, they could pull off one of the greatest ruses that has ever occurred in American politics. They literally created the belief in America, and a majority of Americans, that Donald Trump was actually a stooge of the Russian government and that he had been brought to power through a Russian plot. There wasn't an iota of truth. And a lot of people say, John, I'm always amazed how you were able to go up against the CIA and the FBI and all those people and prove them wrong. It took 3-4 years, obviously. And the truth of the matter is, it's because the real people in the CIA, the real people in the FBI were calling me saying, there's not an iota of truth to this. It's not true. And yet so many Americans were believing. In fact, if you did a poll today, 30 to 40% of Americans still think that Donald Trump won the 2016 election because of a Russian conspiracy. It is really remarkable. But that is what George Soros and the liberal funders set out to do, to own the narrative in America, to change the narrative in America, to own the institutions that control the narrative of America. And there's an amazing meeting, I think it was in 2006, as I recall. And George Soros said, listen, I don't believe elections are going to be won anymore, or his people said this, I don't believe elections are going to be won anymore in the period between Labor Day and Election Day. That's when we all get blitzed by ads and all the flyers got, and you got knocks on your doors and all that. I believe it's going to be won in the 18 months before that. We're going to set the narrative, and by the time the election comes along, it will not matter what we do on the tactical parts of the ground. We'll already own a narrative that will influence and set the terms of the election. And that's really what happened in 2016. It happened again in 2020. Remember the Hunter Biden laptop that wasn't real, except it really was real? 51 members of the United States intelligence community vouched their credentials, the credentials you paid for and I paid for as American taxpayers, and lied to the American people. And I recently got these documents showing they knew what they were doing. Mike Morrell, the former CIA chief, literally wrote, hey, we're just trying to create a talking point for Joe Biden to make the Hunter Biden scandal go away, using the color of authority that you and I gave him. That wasn't an accident. It wasn't an accident, because as time went along, the Soros machinery went beyond just, we want to own the narrative and we want to own these communities in 2006. He said, I see a world where communication is going to move from television to these digital communities. He was talking about the advent of social media, and as Barack Obama showed us in 2008, social media became the new foray for where American politics and where American communications would engage most personally. You put an ad on television, it's, you might hit some people that it connects with, you might not. If you send something to someone's Facebook account and it says, hey, I'm Barack Obama and Sharon Stone, your favorite actress, Sharon Stone contacts you on Facebook and says, Barack Obama told me you're my favorite actress and I want to wish you a happy birthday today. That feels very personal. And the Democrats realized that they were never going to catch up on talk radio, never going to catch up on cable television, never going to catch up on direct mail, but they could catch up in the era of social media. And they put all of their chips on that concept. And they own social media, and to this day, Republicans still struggle with social media. And when Donald Trump began to succeed at it, and Republicans began to see that, they began to just censor and kick people off of social media so that those who have your values couldn't compete there as effectively as it was. That was a strategy, but the intelligence community and the things that happened in 2020 and 2016, they weren't an accident, because around 2014, with the infrastructure now in place and the ability, the language of the debates being changed, all of a sudden Israel was an apartheid state. That's, anyone who's lived in South Africa knows that's ludicrous. But that language was set. They set out on one other mission. Owning the narrative also meant owning the institutions that could carry out action. And they began a global effort to infiltrate the institutions of power, law enforcement. They used to throw, and starting in 2012 and 2013, 2014, they would take George Soros-funded organizations like Transparency International. They would take members of the FBI and the Justice Department on these unbelievable trips to really exotic locations, warm locations in the winter, cool, snowy locations in the summer, and they wined and dined agents. It's actually remarkable that the FBI allowed this to happen. Well, one of those agents who went to like 6 of those conferences from 2012 to 2015 was the agent that found the Black Ledger for Paul Manafort. As we now know, the Black Ledger was a completely ruse. It was literally an artificially created document, and it was actually an intelligence operation inside Ukraine. That's been known. It's actually been verified. But at the time, they were able to turn to one of their FBI agents who they wined and dined for years and get a friendly ear and a friendly voice. And George Soros actually wrote in a strategic plan in 2014, we need to start making friends in the FBI, the State Department. They probably already had a lot of friends in the State Department. That's been pretty communist for a long time. But anyways, they were going to invest there anyways, and local prosecutors and Justice Department prosecutors. And that gave rise in 2016 to the Peace and Justice PAC, which has now funded dozens of district attorneys who let heinous felons out without bail, back onto the streets within 24 hours. He decided if you own the local prosecutor, you can own a lot in the city. If you own the Justice Department or the State Department or the intelligence community, you'll be able to own a lot of outcomes that will further or accentuate your narrative. And that is the system that we operate in today. That is the challenge that we have today. That system has been going for 20 years, and quite frankly, a lot of conservatives feel it's not really worth investing in the narrative-building institutions of America. They're all full of lefties. The answer is they're actually not all full of lefties, but there are a lot of lefties in there. But you have to engage on the narrative if you expect to one day put CRT back into a box, or DEI back into a box, or the terrible moments that we see now where American students, I had this surreal event a few days ago. I interviewed a woman in New York who, after 2 days after the October 7th massacre in Israel, she got a call that her niece had been brutally murdered by the Hamas terrorists in there. And at the moment I was talking to her, I was on the phone with her. She was literally in shock, and I said, "What's wrong?" And I know you're still absorbing the extraordinary loss. She said, "No, I'm more shocked about what I'm seeing outside my window." And she was in a flat in New York, and she opened up the window, and there were students at one of the elite schools in New York chanting, "To the river, to the sea, Palestine will be free." And she said, "I feel more stabbed today than the moment I got the word that my beautiful niece had been murdered." Those narratives were embedded in the college curriculum. They're being embedded today in the K through 12. Teachers unions, news media organizations, social media organizations are all now on a common mission of defining and owning narratives that are not the narrative of America. They're not your narrative. They're not the narrative that will actually allow this country to succeed for another 248 years. So that's depressing. I know it sounds very depressing, but it's good to have the actual knowledge of what's going on. That actually happened. I chronicled it all in a bunch of research papers. And a few years ago, I had the blessing to have a long, long car ride with my good friend. I see him out there, Steve Hantler. Steve Hantler has put more people together and created more dynamic partnerships in the conservative movement than anyone I've ever met in my life. And we were in a long car ride, and I told him this story. He's like, "How did we get to this messed up point?" I told him the whole story. He's like, there's a long pause, and then he said, "Well, why don't we do that?" And the answer is, that is the good question. Why don't we do that? And over the last few years, through the generosity of people like Bernie Marcus and others, we've begun to create narrative-building institutions in America that are beginning to change the narrative or blunt the narrative of Democrats on their march towards a socialist America. I'll give you a couple of good examples. I've been writing about Hunter Biden, well, for 4 years, but only in the last 3 or 4 months has the mainstream media actually decided, oh, maybe this story's real. Here's why. A couple of years ago, we discovered that George Soros and the left had like 5 whistleblower centers, and they only take whistleblower complaints from liberal people. What an idea. Well, we created a whistleblower center on the right, and those IRS whistleblowers who emerged this summer and literally turned the narrative of the Hunter Biden investigation on its head and made believers of people like CBS News and CNN. They're now being reported as legitimate whistleblowers. Those came through a new ecosystem that we're all building here. We now have 2,200 news sites and institutions that work together every morning. We sit on a news call and we try to create narratives that change what happened in the daily agenda of politics. And it's beginning to work. Last month, that little ecosystem reached 105 million Americans. 105 million Americans got some form of news or contact from this ecosystem. We're only about 1.5 years old. It's going to continue to grow. But the ability to set the narrative, to combat the narrative, is going to be essential if all of the values that you want are going to truly be passed down to your children and your grandchildren, and the American experience as we know it is going to continue and live on, or is it going to be hijacked like it feels like it is at this very moment? That is the moment I think we are at. That's the challenge that we have, and I know it's hard for us to say, oh God, the last thing I want to do is talk to a reporter or deal with the media or try to combat some of this stuff. But the phase we're in now is that the left is so confident in what it has built that it has now gone to the next route. It has created an entire infrastructure to cancel not only your ability to speak freely, but also to cancel the business models that you and I may need to get our message out. There are huge institutions that have been created in the last couple of years, things like Check My Ads. If you haven't heard of them, anyone in the news industry has heard of them. They've reduced ad revenues to conservative and moderate websites by over $1 billion a year. Just think about that. $1 billion, the main fuel that drives news organizations that might be willing to tell your side of the story, they've had their business model eradicated by a cancel culture led by things like NewsGuard. Here's another thing. What a great idea. NewsGuard is going to take people who created false narratives in 2016 and 2020. Its board member is Mike Hayden, the former CI director, who was one of the leaders of that letter. And they're going to now arbitrate what stories are true and which ones are not. It's a really great idea, right? That institution now has 80% of Madison Avenue listening to it and determining where they're going to put their future dollars. And I'll tell you what, they're not putting them in institutions that are telling the truth like my side is and like Breitbart's doing and some of the others. We need to put that back in a box. Similarly, you have an extraordinary infrastructure of universities funded by the Biden administration to the tune of $20, $30 million now that go out all day and determine what's going to be called disinformation. And in real time, as we saw with the extraordinary lawsuit of Biden v. Missouri, they've actually been able to get entire stories canceled on social media, on television networks, stories that were true. Stories like, actually, the origins of the virus, the FBI and the Energy Department believed from the beginning of the coronavirus was the Wuhan lab. But that was canceled. I was called a conspiracy theorist for about 18 months because I was one of the first people to report that. Today, the FBI and the Energy Department, as they did already believe in 2020, have affirmed that. But for 2 years, you, the American public, the voting public, was deprived. And anyone who even dared utter that had a tinfoil hat put on their head, either figuratively or literally, through this infrastructure that's been building. So we've gone from an era of creating institutions that can control a narrative to now creating institutions that will suppress a narrative. And there has never been a time, ever in the American experience, where the First Amendment in free speech is in graver danger than this moment. Now, that said, just like what happened with Brexit, just like what happened with Job Creators Network stepping into the void and pushing out the woke Chamber of Commerce and the woke NFIB, there are amazing things going on right now. One of the many institutions that, through the generosity of Bernie Marcus and others, that we've been able to create is the Foundation for Freedom Online, a guy named Mike Benz. People on the left call him a four-letter word. His name really is 4 letters, so he gets away with that. But he has single-handedly brought to the forefront the knowledge of this censorship thing, the map of this censorship thing. His work, along with the news organizations like mine that are part of the ecosystem, has been able to get the Missouri v. Biden case now to the Supreme Court. Most of the examples that show up in that lawsuit were dug up by that new ecosystem of conservative sites. I don't even call them conservative, I just call them common sense, moderate websites. Most of them reach 30 to 40% of the readers are liberal and moderate, which is so important. We have to be able to talk more than to just ourselves. But we've been able to create new narratives. The IRS narrative, the narrative that somehow maybe cutting energy supplies in America might actually be behind the rise in energy prices. I know for most of you, that's common sense, but to my colleagues in the leftist side of the media, that's actually anathema to them. Like, no, that doesn't happen. No, that's not the reason it is. It's Russia. No, it's not. It's us. We were energy independent in 2020. We're now energy dependent on Russia and Iran and Venezuela. Slowly, though, we're beginning to change that narrative, and I think that is the mission. If I leave you with one thought tonight, you not only need to invest in all of the regulatory battles that you're winning with Job Creators Network, you not only have to invest in the infrastructure and early voting, because the Democrats have a great monopoly there, though that's beginning to change, and I think the Virginia legislature next week will give us perhaps a test case that we can take an election back through early voting. But you also have to invest in the capabilities of the future narrative building in America. And this is the narrative question that we all must ask our neighbors, our friends, our children, our grandchildren. Is this really the America we want to live in? Is this the America we want to live in, where our children chant anti-Semitic tropes and spew hatred, or their teachers embed that hatred in them? Is this the America where a young girl goes into a high school bathroom and a biological male has been allowed to go in there, she's sexually assaulted, and then the school district covers it up for 8 months, and when her father tries to contest it, he gets arrested for disrupting a school board meeting? Is that the America we want? That is the question that we have to ask day in and day out, and the narrative we need to build is, no, that's not the America we want, and this is the America we want. Those narrative building tools are now, for the first time, because of the brilliance and vision of people like Bernie Marcus and others like him, are beginning to take root. They're beginning to turn the tide. I think you'll see next week a major shift in the Hunter Biden story. I may have a thing or two to do with that. But it will actually move it again, and you'll see mainstream news media. They're sitting alongside of me Thursday and Friday, writing alongside me a story that we're going to break together. That is the opportunity we have. We can turn this back just like Nigel turned back Brexit and the Job Creators Network turned back the vaccine mandate against all odds before the Supreme Court. That moment is here. We need to seize it. We cannot ignore the narrative in America any longer. And I'd like to leave that thought with you as we go. And then I'd like to open up, I think, the floor for some questions. I got one last night, so while we're doing that, I promised I'd answer this question on stage. A young lady came up to me last night. I was coming to the hallway, and she said, what's it been like for the last 4 or 5 years to be on television with such extraordinary journalists like Sarah Carter and now Amanda Head? I'm very blessed to work with two really courageous American journalists along my side, and we work, and they've taught me the tricks of television, because with a face like this, I was never meant to be on television. And so, the answer is, in one very simple word, humbling. And I'll just give you this anecdote because it's a very true anecdote, but it's reminded me often of how extraordinarily lucky I am, but also how extraordinarily appreciative the American public is when you dive into the void and you try to fill the narrative with truth as opposed to disinformation. A couple of years ago, Sean Hannity had Sarah Carter and I on stage at an event at CPAC. He did a live show. Fox was doing it. They were throwing footballs. It was a great time. And Sarah and I were sort of the main guests, and they asked us to go through how we unraveled the Russia collusion story. And we told our story, and then we were exhausted. It had been a long day, and Sean, like he often does, doesn't tell us what he's going to do. And he's like, hey, John and Sarah are going to go outside that door, and for the next hour, they're going to hang out with you outside. And they think I wasn't prepared to do that, but we went and did it. And for about 45 minutes or an hour, amazing people came up to us, and we had this great conversation about it. And the people are so smart. The greatest blind spot that the left has is that they think Americans are stupid. That is their Achilles heel. And the American people are not stupid. We just need to get them the facts and information. But at the very end, as we're about 40, 45 minutes in, this extraordinary man shuffles up. He's got a cane. He's wearing a Vietnam veteran's hat. He is a significant winner of heroism awards during the Vietnam War. And he comes up, and I'm sitting to the side of Sarah, and he comes up, he grabs her hand, he looks adoringly in her eyes, and it kind of feels like a Rockwell moment, like a painting's about to be made here. And he looks and he grabs her hand, and he says, Sarah, you are more beautiful in person than you even are on television. By the way, that's true. And I was sitting there smiling for a second, thinking, wow, that was an amazing moment. Then he looked up to me and said, you, not so much. And that's how humbling it is to work with Sarah Carter and Amanda Head every day. So that's a true story, too. So.